This episode, I'm joined by Joshua Buhs to discuss his new book, Think to New Worlds, The Cultural History of Charles Fort and His Followers. I'd like to say a big thank you to all my paying patrons and subscribers for making all of this work possible. And if you'd like to support the podcast and keep everything running, please find links in the description below. Otherwise, please enjoy. So, Joshua Buhs, thanks very much for joining me on Hermitix podcast.
Well, thank you for having me.
We are going to be discussing your soon-to-be-released book, Think to New Worlds, The Cultural History of Charles Fort and His Followers. And I say soon-to-be-released, it should be a couple of weeks or 1 week from when this episode releases, 2nd of July this year, published by University of Chicago Press, who were kind enough to send me a review copy of the book, so thanks very much to them. As people will imagine from the title, it is a book about Charles Fort, his legacy, the Fortean, as you describe it, the Fortean effect on modern culture, and how you personally are arguing that Charles Fort's sort of influence on modern society is far more far-reaching than we might assume. So this is such a broad book, just filled to the brim with interesting Fortean ephemera. It's just fascinating. There is almost everyone, it seems, turns up at some point in this book. It was a fantastic read, a very enjoyable read. But before we dive into Fort and the text itself, Joshua, just tell us a little bit about yourself, what it is you do, and the genesis of this book. Because I believe it's had quite a... I was reading on your website, it's had quite a long genesis.
Yes. Well, thank you for that very kind introduction. Yeah, the gestation has been very long on this. So this is my third book as essentially as an independent scholar. And my previous book was on Bigfoot, but not on arguing whether Bigfoot existed or not existed, but kind of looking at the people who are interested in how that legend was perpetuated. And in kind of looking at that, I came across these Forteans and became fascinated by them. And so then started investigating who they were, how they came to be. And it opened up this entire world to me. And the world was bigger than I'd expected and not as well delineated as I expected. And then there were certain personal issues that made it a little bit longer process than I had anticipated. But yeah, so that's kind of the origin story of the book, and the process that went with it.
So your sort of independent scholarly history with Bigfoot and Charles Fort around these, with Fort especially, you're throwing the absolute grab bag of outsider happenings and strange, anomalous things happening, UFOs, aliens, ghosts, the supernatural, all of this kind of stuff. Did you, and of course you put Bigfoot and something more modern like the Dogman you could put in there as well now. Just regards to your own sort of scholarly background, did you have experiences with these kind of things prior to writing these books, or is this strictly an academic interest?
No, I mean it's strictly academic. So my academic background is I do have a doctorate in history and sociology of science from the University of Pennsylvania, and so my early work was actually on environmental history, and I looked at debates over pesticide use and a particular campaign against fire ants. And so what was interesting to me there was the kind of the construction of that insect as evil, to put a fine point on it. And so kind of looking at that construction kind of led me then to I wanted to look at how Bigfoot was constructed. And so it just kind of moved off from there. And so it was just kind of this slow development, step by step, kind of towards Fort in a way that I didn't anticipate.
I see. I see. So moving into Charles Fort, the years here are born 1874, dies 1932. Did anything immediately strike you about this man? How did you begin entering into the depths of all that is Fortean? Where did you really begin? Because it's, as I said before, I mean, maybe you'll disagree with me, but there was just so much information in your book. Something about Fort seems to just gravitate a density of data and information.
Yeah, that is definitely true. So, I mean, he wrote 4 what we could call nonfiction texts, which themselves are really encyclopedic. They are grab bags of anomalous reports that are hung together on his own philosophy, and so that those books themselves are very dense with information. And then I was particularly interested in his influence, and so the people who came to follow him, which one was difficult to track down, but two, there were a lot of them. And so my kind of entryway into the story was there was a Fortean society. There were actually several Fortean societies, but there was the one that persisted after his death was run by a ad man and novelist named Tiffany Thayer, and it ran for 28 years. And so what I did is I went through all 28 years of the run and found every name that I could and traced down biographically who these people were and kind of started to compile prosopography of the Forteans and kind of trace it out from there. And so, yeah, it was just a large collection of data from which to work.
So for those that aren't, maybe have just heard his name or aren't fully aware of what it is, who Charles Fort was or what it is to be Fortean, you've mentioned his books. Would you describe him as the original skeptic, or do you think he's approaching these anomalous experiences, UFOs, ghosts, whatever it might be, in a different way as we would now define a skeptic?
Yeah, so I guess we should give a little context of who Charles Fort was. Yeah, so Charles Fort, as you said, born in 1874 in Albany, grew up the son of a grocer, was both physically and emotionally abused by his father, eventually made his way to Brooklyn, where he was a journalist, through a series of inheritances. One was able to kind of make a life for himself, the first of which allowed him to do some world traveling. He came back in 1896, married a childhood friend named Anna Filing. They set themselves up in Brooklyn, where he tried to make a life as a writer, struggled for a long time, through the early 1900s, putting out short stories. Found a patron in the novelist Theodore Dreiser. Tried to shift to novel writing, was unsuccessful in doing so. And then another inheritance kind of stabilized his position in the 1910s. And this is when he shifted to writing his 4 books on anomalies. First one came out in 1919. It was called The Book of the Damned. It was followed by, over the next 12 years, by 3 others. And these collected just a number of oddities that have become kind of classic. Rains of blood, rains of fish, reports of flying saucers or anomalies in the air, talking dogs, all sorts of strange reports. In terms of being a skeptic, it's not a skepticism that we would see today. The skepticism that I think we think of today are the perhaps the rationalists are what first come to mind when I think of a skeptic. Somebody from what used to be called CSI, COP, now CSI, the Martin Gardner kind of skeptic, rationalist, scientific debunking of the paranormal. And he was certainly not that. He was much more playful with these anomalies that he found. And his overall position, I guess you could say, is that he saw them as keys to understanding how the world worked. And so should we take some time and kind of outline his philosophy of philosophy? Is that what you'd like? Do you think that?
Sure, yeah. I mean, that sounds like a good foundation. Yeah.
Okay. So I think the easiest way to do this is to say that Fort divided history up into three eras. Right? The first one was what he called the religious dominant. Then the era that he was living through at that time was called the scientific dominant. And what he first foresaw coming was the era of the hyphen, or the intermediate era. And in each of the eras, like in the religious dominant, the way religion became dominant, became of the truth-making machine, was by defining certain things as untrue, as something to be shunned. What science did to become dominant was something very similar. It said that there are certain facts, certain anomalies that just are not true. They're unthinkable. They are not right. But they should be considered, he would say. They need to be recovered. A classic example would be meteors. Mm-hmm. So when meteors were first noticed by French peasants in the early 1700s, the French scientists of the day said, well, the peasants are wrong. They don't know what they're talking about. These are just stones that have been struck by lightning. They're definitely not they're definitely not things that have come from outer space. They are anomalies, and they are something to be defined out of our scientific dominant. But obviously, what came to be true later was that the scientists were wrong. And Fort would say that this is true of many, many, many things that scientists say are untrue, including brains of fish, brains of blood. And so his idea was that we needed to broaden our sense of knowledge and incorporate all of these anomalies. Not to say that they are necessarily true, or not to say that they are necessarily false, but that they are intermediate between true and false. And so that everything is a mixture of true and false. And that is the era that he hoped to be leading us to, an era of the hyphen, the intermediate era, where things are both true and not true at the same time. And so this is why it's hard to call him a skeptic per se, because he wouldn't say that these anomalies are true. He wouldn't say that they were not true. He would say that they are somewhere in between, and that everything is equally at this in-betweenness.
Mm-hmm. Mm-hmm. And so a lot of these have connections, I guess, throughout time, and traditionally speaking, especially many of them that might be supernatural, such as ghosts. and I guess maybe even aliens to an extent, they have a connection to the supernatural, to possibly something we might call sacred or divine. And so, is Fort bringing with him anything like a belief? Well, anything like a belief, I guess, outside of his philosophical, historical framework there that you outlined. Does he have his own theological framework?
Well, he casts what he's talking about in kind of a religious language. So when he talks about things being outside or inside the dominant, so he would say anomalies have been damned. And that's why the first book gets the name, the Book of the Damned. And things that are accepted as true are heavenly. And that things and I'm using that word kind of advisedly because he talks about them as things. So it's kind of these objects. All go through these waves in which they are damned and then they are heavenly, much like the meteors were. The meteors were damned and then they were heavenly. And what he kind of foresees in this era of the hyphen is that we're more moving towards what he would call a purgatory, where things are in this constant state of flux, where they're going from damned to heavenly and then kind of passing through this purgatory. He says the same thing about magic, the supernatural. What was once magic will become science, which was once science will become magic. And he sees things always in this state of flux. Nothing is ever static in his system. And so it's hard to say that he has a clear sense of the sacred or the divine, because at least as I think of it, the sacred or the divine is always on one side of a line. Mm-hmm. Sacred is that is special, it is reserved, and he doesn't see things in those kind of static terms. Everything is, as I say, in flux.
But he does have his four gods. Now, I found this very intriguing. So these aren't exactly gods in the usual sense, but he seems to use these as a guiding force in his life. Might that be correct in saying that?
Yeah. So okay. So after he returned, so he said he went on a trip around the world in the late 1890s, and then he returned and settled down in Brooklyn with his wife Anna, and he started talking in correspondence about four what he would call orthogenetic gods. Orthogenetic meaning that these are gods that are pushing him and pushing the world in a certain direction. Orthogenetic meaning directional. Mm-hmm. He talked about Syntheticus. This is the god that would be combining things. He talked about a god Amorpha. This is the god of order. He talks about a god of decomposition, which he saw as very important. But he also, the most important of them was the god of equilibration. And we see that in terms of the same flux that he's talking about. So everything that is at one time heavenly, we will be equilibrated at some other point in time as being damned. And everything that is damned will be equilibrated at some point in being heavenly. And so there's this sense that he talks about them as gods, but they are also one could also interpret them as natural processes, that they are fundamental laws of the universe. So it's never clear to me whether he is being playful in talking about them as divine beings or whether he is serious, which is often a problem with reading or interpreting Fort, is that he has this playful personality that makes it where he's always winking, and it makes it difficult to um, understand just how serious he's being at any one time.
Mm. So this, with regard to this equilibrium, and then of course this hyphen stage where things are always going back between the heavenly and the damned, is there a teleology for Fort? Is the universe, the cosmos, heading towards some point, some reason, maybe even some truth, purpose for its existence? Or is this flux that he has found in this third hyphen era just eternally ongoing?
I My reading is that yes, there is a teleology, and yes, it is. We are heading towards this better time, this era of the hyphen. It's not 100% clear whether the universe is moving there on its own or whether it requires encouragement by people like Fort in terms of pointing out these things and helping nudge us along and move us past the scientific dominant so that we can see the errors of our ways.
So how is this? I mean, I guess especially with the Book of the Damned, because as if I'm understanding the history correctly, the Book of the Damned is sort of his most famous work. How is this initially all received? Because is there anyone like Charles Fort prior to Fort? You know, a sort of anomaly researcher? Is he really the beginning of that whole atmosphere?
Yeah, so the Book of the Damned, it's generally well received as a book. It's goes through several printings, three, I believe, if I remember correctly. And gets good reviews. Although it's not clear how much of it is in response to the overall philosophy as much as it is to his kind of style and voice and collection of oddities. That seems to be what most of the reviewers and the readers that I have seen are responding to, as opposed to his kind of philosophy about things moving from the damned to the heavenly. In terms of researching anomalies, there are books that talk about the anomalous going back here and there, but his really kicks off what you would say the 20th century modern anomalous research is. Yes, there are few predecessors that he is building on, but his we could say is the origin of that kind of writing that we see today in about ufology, cryptozoology. Any of those kinds of writings are going to trace themselves back to Fort.
So just before we sort of move into the influence, just one sort of final question to build this foundation, because I think it will probably tie in with what the definition of a Fortean or maybe even a Fortean analysis is. Maybe I've sort of touched on it, but what then is truth for Fort? Can there be such a thing of truth? Sort of, is there an objective truth outside of this sort of relativism of these eras, or is truth always contextual in that way?
He's very clear in his books that he doesn't believe in truth. He'll say again and again that he doesn't believe in ideas as anything more than to try on for the moment. He makes it very clear that what he is offering in his books are expressions and not truths. So there is no sense of anything being true for him.
So what is it to be Fortean then?
Yeah, no, that's fine. I mean, from his perspective, it is a case of having suspended judgment in all matters at all times, which is a very high standard, and which there's internal debate among the Forteans, most of whom well, many of whom will admit they don't meet that standard, and others of whom will not even try. So in terms of being Fortean in that way, I don't think it's something that people. I don't think it's something that Forteans. Um, that is not a characteristic of later Forteans.
Did Ford himself uphold that standard, do you think, or did he? Is there any biases that you found within his work?
I think. Well, I th I think that there's a way in which when people when one is that uh committed to being not um taking a stand, they are still kind of taking a stand, because it is to say that his need to say no, to deny, to reject, um, in essence, leads him to have certain kinds of judgment. So that if he wants to have a suspended judgment about an aerial phenomenon that is otherwise uh, causing people to wonder, but but scientists to be sure in their judgment, he is kind of putting his thumb on the scale in terms of refusing the scientist's point of view. And so I think it's too much to say that he actually had a purely suspended judgment, if that makes sense.
That does make sense, yeah. One thing I just sort of skipped over just before we sort of move, I guess, to the future post-Fort, because you say he has this style, he has this voice. These are more so, I can't remember how you describe them, but they're not so much facts as sort of retellings, and he does have this style. Who influenced Ford? What influences do we see in the way he writes?
So it's really hard to tell. He didn't leave a lot of clear like documentation about it, but if you kind of just looking at when he was writing and who he was kind of in conversation with, it seems that he would have been reading some of the writers maybe that we don't know as well anymore. There was a writer who was popular at the time, isn't as well known anymore, named Benjamin de Caceres, who have been an influence. He probably would have been reading other writers of the decadent movement. And there's obviously he was reading Theodore Dreiser. And it's likely that he would have been reading some of the early modernists, perhaps Ezra Pound, Ben Hecht, people like that.
Okay. So moving forward, then we have this foundation. We have Fort's worldview, if we will, his eras, the development of, I guess, what it is to be Fortean. So when does this? Because this is really after a sort of introduction and a constant sort of building of Fort's biography within your book. The bulk of the book, the purpose of the book, if you want to put it that way, is this cultural history. And so when does the the Fortean begin? Does it begin within Fort's own lifetime, or does it take a little while for that culture to begin?
So Forteans, as such, begin within his life, within his life. I mean, the term itself is coined right after the publication of the Book of the Damned. Ben Hecht, who would later become a famous movie writer, calls himself the first Fortean. There were a couple of attempts in the 20s to start a Fortean society of one sort or another. These fell apart. Then the Fortean society that would last is started in 1931, a year before his death, by Tiffany Thayer and Theodore Dreiser. So there is an attempt to kind of memorialize the man and his works from the get-go. He inspires people.
Is he himself? Does he himself comment on this sort of immortalization? Is he on board?
He very much despises it. He does not like the attention. He's a very shy man, and finds it off-putting, and kind of contrary to what he is attempting to do. It's kind of erecting a cult or a dominant, or kind of making too solid his own ideas when he wants them to be much more fluid and flexible. And so, yeah, he opposes it from the beginning. And so, which is one reason why it really doesn't take off until after his death.
So I've been using the word Fortean a lot, and of course they're from Hecht. He used the word Fortean. Do you think the way that word's used just to describe that general landscape is correct, or would Fort even say, "Look, Fortean, we shouldn't even be doing that. Just investigate these things yourselves"?
Yeah, I mean, I think he would oppose it. I mean, so there was as I said, there was the society was erected when he was still alive, and with essentially a single meeting, and they were trying to start a second meeting, or they were trying to have a second meeting, and he immediately said, well, we should call this the Neo-Fortean Society, because he wanted to get past it so quickly. He would not approve of the name, and I don't think he would approve of many of the things that are being said in his name. So no, I don't think that he would appreciate much of what falls under that umbrella.
Okay, I'm interested there. You said much of what is said under his name he wouldn't appreciate. What are there some clear things that stand out that you see that have fallen under the term Fortean, but really just don't work within those bounds?
I think you can. I think the two clearest and most persistent progeny, for lack of a better word, of Forteanism are cryptozoology, so the hunt, the study of hidden animals, so Bigfoot, Loch Ness, etc., and ufology, the study of UFOs. And both of these are done in ways that are don't really fit with the Fortean model as we've kind of talked about it so far. The cryptozoology is much more definitive than anything Fort would have written about, independent of kind of the conclusions going much ahead of the evidence. And then ufology is, as it's come to be, is much more speculative and has developed a theology that is very elaborate. And I'm speaking generally here. I mean, obviously, there's a wide variety of ufology, but there's much of it has developed a very speculative theology that is not Fortean in many ways, although many ufologists would still trace themselves back to Fort or point to Fort as supporting evidence for their field of belief.
Okay. So why? Well, okay. There's a couple of questions. So one would be, science fiction plays a huge role here. As probably won't come as a surprise to many people that Fort, as per your book, begins to influence science fiction. But also, sort of, there's an undercurrent in your book that Fort is Fort and this Fortean heritage is extremely important, really, to modernity, and it's almost like, dare I say it, in much the same way that people speak about Shakespeare, and they'll say that we don't realize how many turns of phrase have come from Shakespeare that we say every day. Is it the case, of course, on a lesser level, that with Fort, much of these sort of anomalous symbols that we're all so familiar with really were born with Fort and his research?
Yeah, I mean, yes, I think that's true. I think that was actually one of the things that attracted me to the subject, is that so much of what we accept as, for lack of a better term, our modern mythology, our modern legends, trace themselves back to Fort, the things that we just kind of all know about in some way, are Fortean, if not from Fort himself, right? If you mention the Bermuda Triangle, everybody has kind of some vague sense, and even some vague sense that it's true. But why do we know that? Well, it's a Fortean construct. Same thing with UFOs. Same thing with Bigfoot or Loch Ness Monster, as I mentioned. People have vaguely heard about rains of fish, and there's these background knowledge that is Fortean, and that I find this one of the fascinating aspects of Fortean history, just the way it's built into so much of what we know and accept, and that's part of the burden of the book, is that also as I look at some of these writers, right? It's Henry Miller just mentions Fort in passing, accepting that people will understand what he's talking about, or it's in William Gaddis's The Recognitions. He's mentioning it offhand. It's the surrealists have Fort built into some of what they're doing, and so I think that is, as I say, part of the fascinating part of Fort is just the way he has become something that is just part of the air we breathe.
In looking at this history, I mean, a very, very broad history as well, did you ever notice a thread as to why, generation after generation, we are consistently interested in Fortean phenomena? And almost, even sort of seemingly, you might say, serious people still always hold a bit of a fascination. I think we can't help but be fascinated by such things. Did you ever pull out a thread as to why that is? Or is it just human nature?
Well, yeah, I mean, I think partly it's human nature. I think partly it's what Fort was getting at with his idea of the dominance, is the eras of the dominance, is that there is something that is outside, right? We have kind of created a walled garden in where we say these are the acceptable subjects, acceptable ways to think and talk and then there are these things outside, and they are then kind of inherently fascinating and enticing. And all that we might want life to be tidy and nice and within those gardens, everybody has certain experiences that do not fit nicely or tightly within those gardens. And so there is then an attraction to something that is outside, and we look for ways to explain it. We look for the language, we look for the theories or hypotheses that can help us make sense of what doesn't fit within the dominant. I think that's kind of the thread that I pull out of there.
Mm. So I guess just to draw on one of the key threads, how does this all begin for science fiction? Because really science fiction, I'm trying to think H.G. Wells, I can't remember what era H.G. Wells was, so we could say maybe that was the beginning roughly of sci-fi. But do you see Fort really there as maybe not a founder, but an inspirational founder of modern sci-fi?
So I see Fort as a founder of a certain strain of science fiction. So that, H.G. Wells would have been writing science fiction slightly before and then during the time that Fort was writing. And afterwards, he starts moving more towards, Wells starts writing more in the vein of nonfiction. And there's something, and Fort is drawing on the writers of kind of fantastic literature at that time. So he's very influenced by them. But he also then goes on to influence later writers. And it's these anomalies that he's writing about that gives a lot of that influence. So anomalies are interesting to some science fiction writers because they offer a way to structure their stories. So anomalies can be a window into the way that the universe works. So here's a classic example is a story by Eric Frank Russell, who was one of the most important Forteans. He was second in command of the Fortean Society. And he wrote a novel called Sinister Barrier. And the anomaly here was that several scientists were all dying, and they were all working on a similar project. And when the investigators figured out what the anomaly was, what was going on, they found out that there was a otherwise invisible set of beings that lived around the earth but could not be seen. They were outside of our visual spectrum, so they were beyond this sinister barrier of our visual spectrum. And that they were feeding on the energy that human beings gave off, especially during wartime. And so these Bytons, as they were called, were encouraging humans to have war. And so it was this anomaly that allowed people to see the true structure of the universe. And this was something that was very important to a lot. This was something that became very important to a lot of science fiction writers. This use of anomalies to see the actual engine, the mechanism that made the world work. And so they turned to Fort. They used a lot of the Fortean anomalies. They read his book. They read all four of his books and turned to these as plot devices. And it became important to the kind of ideology of science fiction as well, because the ideology of science fiction became that not only is science fiction an interesting story, but it's a way to actually influence human development, human evolution, that we were no longer victims of the forces of nature, but we could actually control them and create our own future. And so prior to Fort, there'd been kind of one of the big strands of science fiction had been that science fiction was about kind of technology tales. It was about new gadgets and how those gadgets could help people. And Fort kind of inaugurated this different strand of science fiction. And so, which persists to today. And so there's this way in which he imbibed a lot of the early fantasy writers, early science fiction writers, but also then influenced later science fiction writers. And yeah.
So is the Fortean Society, is it still running? It sounded like there was a fair few maybe schisms, or are they just completely different societies?
Yeah, they were just completely different societies. Okay. And then, yeah, the Fortean Society, the one that I talk about in the book, that one ended in 1959 with the death of Tiffany Thayer. I don't know, within the next 10 years, there was a second one created by some people called the International Fortean Organization. It is not clear to me whether that one still runs or not. And then more famously, the Fortean Times started in the early 1970s, first as the News, and then it developed into the Fortean Times. There are now several small organizations, but there's nothing that would be considered kind of the center of the Fortean universe, the way that the Fortean Society was the center of the Fortean universe between the 30s and the 50s.
Okay. So it's going to ask this question of where do we see Fort's influence today, but I think we sort of made that clear. But is there anywhere that we might not realize we are seeing Fort's influence today?
That's an interesting question.
Or we could skip that question.
Well, no. It's interesting. So it's making me think. There are lots of places he shows up in ways that people might not fully appreciate, even if although maybe a few moments of thought would get you there. You could say that conspiracy theorizing has become very normalized, say, over the last 20 years. And there is a way in which that is also owes something to the Forteans, that owes something to Fort. And so, yeah, I think there's a way in which Fortean resonances still run in just our news in ways that people might not always appreciate.
Okay. Is there anything you'd like to add about Charles Fort or this Fortean cultural history that you feel we haven't touched upon that is key, or perhaps a sort of particular Fortean moment that you greatly enjoy?
I think what I enjoyed most about this project was that it allowed me to investigate so many corners of culture. We've spent a lot of time on Fort and on science fiction, which I think is excellent. But it did give me a chance to read and write about modernist poetry. And did give me a chance to read and write about theosophy. And that was something that I just found very intellectually engaging and unexpected. And I think that people who would pick up the book would find that also It is a interesting ride that will take you in a lot of different places.
And what are you, dare I say, what are you working on? What are you working on now?
Right now, I'm just taking kind of I've not quite figured out what I want to do right now.
Okay. So we should be able to, I'll put the links for the book from the University of Chicago Press website in the description below for people who want to purchase the book, which is releasing 2nd of July. And then there is also your own blog that I will link in the description below. But other than those two things, is there anything you'd like to add?
I think that was everything. Thank you very much. It was a very fun discussion.
It was a great discussion. Thank you very much.